Hi everyone, this is David Peña-Guzmán,
And I'm Ellie Anderson.
and we are here today to talk about whether everyone should do philosophy. So, Ellie, let's talk about that. You and I are professional philosophers, and this
Yeah.
is a question that we often get, not just from students, but I would say from friends and acquaintances.
Mm-hmm.
I get the question, I loved philosophy when I was younger, but is it for everybody?
Yeah.
Or how do we think about who should or should not enter this field?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times the question too comes from what I find to be a well-meaning but ultimately misguided concern, which is philosophy elitist?
Mhm.
And if it's not accessible to everyone, isn't there something weird about saying that everyone should do it? And I will just say, I think the historical elitism or lack of access that many people have to what we call philosophy, which we also want to talk more about what we mean by that, doesn't really give us an answer about whether people should or should not do philosophy, right? It's almost as if, if we ask another question, like, should people own property or not? The fact that most people throughout history have not had the means to own property is not a good answer to that question, right? It's helpful context, but it's not a good answer.
Yeah,
So,
no, but you're right that the question then almost canalizes our thinking in different directions, because it's very different to say, is everybody, can or should everybody do philosophy, which places the burden on people, on
Yeah.
individuals, versus is philosophy welcoming to everybody, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
one is a question of whether people have sometimes the aptitude or the interest in
Mhm.
pursuing this line of work. Another one is whether the line of work itself is open enough, is welcoming enough, and is not hostile to particular groups of people, which we
Yeah.
know historically philosophy has been towards. It has been hostile to women, it has been hostile to people of color. And in some of my work, I've also explored how it's very jarring for people from low income backgrounds, just
Mhm.
because it takes place in its contemporary form in institutions of higher learning
Yeah.
that have a particular class scaffolding.
Okay, so I want to come back to that, I think, a little bit later. But for now, before we get into sort of that critical answer to this question, I want to just put some ideas on the table about what we mean when we're talking about philosophy. So when we ask the question, should everyone do philosophy, so much hinges on what we mean by philosophy and also by doing philosophy.
Okay.
And so I think, in a sense, if we take philosophy broadly as some kind of inquiry into the conditions of our life and, asking questions about why things are the way they are, right? That like broad why question, or as the love of wisdom, the Greek root of the term philosophy or philosophia, then it seems to me that the question is a weird one because people are always already doing philosophy. Like most of us are asking in our everyday lives. We might not be asking what are the fundamental objects in the universe, but we certainly are
We might
asking.
be sometimes, who knows?
But we're asking questions about who am I, what should I do, what's the meaning of life, in really mundane ways, I think, in our everyday lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that came up in the Gramsci video that I have on YouTube, which is Gramsci's claim that even if not everybody has the social status of an intellectual, everybody is an intellectual.
Yeah.
Because everybody has a certain conception of the universe, a certain understanding of their place in the cosmos, and because it just is part of what it means to be a human being that we think about our conditions of existence, even if we don't always articulate them in ways that register as quote unquote philosophical in the more technical sense of the term. And I mean, this is something that we see even with children, right? Children are philosophers insofar as what children do is they ask questions and they love learning things.
Yeah.
And so
one of my favorite books on that point is The Philosophical Baby by Alison Gopnik too.
Oh, yes,
I think I've told you about this.
yes.
I love that book on this point. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you. Just
well,
wanted
and
to plug
now
that.
there's a whole movement called P4C, P number 4, C, philosophy
Philosophy
for
for
children.
Children.
And it's an entire movement in philosophical education and pedagogy that is designed to encourage children, I mean, elementary school kids, sometimes as young as kindergarten,
Yeah.
to engage in philosophical reflection
Mm-hmm.
and to ask questions that they're not asking, especially not in the US, where philosophy is not regularly or really ever taught in elementary school, middle school, or high school, and such that they have some experience in the kind of thinking that philosophy encourages and cultivates, which is not necessarily tied to right and wrong questions, or I'm sorry, to right and wrong answers, and that is not just tied to the memorization of information, but rather to appreciating the diversity of answers that one can give to a broad question that, creates wonder in that philosophia, that love of wisdom that you're mentioning.
Yeah, and I think your mention of the fact that in the US at least, we don't generally have education at the high school or elementary school levels in philosophy is part of the reason for posing the question. I mean, yes. I think this question, should everyone do philosophy, would seem strange in a context like France, where high school students all have to study philosophy. It would almost be like asking, should everybody study history or should everybody study English? Yeah. And I think a lot more Americans would have obvious yeses to that question. And it wouldn't seem so much like, oh, if you say everyone should study history, you're elitist. It's like, no, everyone should have the right to study history. Everyone should have the conditions that foster this study of history. And I will say, I mean, that's kind of how I feel about philosophy too. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to love it, because I think one of the things that you get in France is that people have they have many more opinions about philosophy than people do here. And sometimes those opinions are, I hated my philosophy class. I hated that I was forced to take it in high school, right?
Yeah, and fair enough, like I've hated some of the classes that I've taken, but the whole point here being that I am able to develop an opinion about it because I was exposed to it. Mm-hmm. Whereas if that exposure is never there to begin with, it means that you end up with a reified conception of what the philosopher is, which is just this like distant, aloof character that you've never met in real life, that has never been in front of the classroom for you, and that only exists in institutions of higher learning, but that has had to that only exists at the end of a very long process of formation, right? Like with a PhD in hand.
Totally.
And so it does give us a very limited kind of slice of, or a limited image of what it means to do philosophy, where doing philosophy means specifically being a professional academic philosopher.
Yeah, well, and I think this leads to another question about how we're conceiving of philosophy, because in moving from talking about philosophy as something that most of us are always already doing when we're asking why questions in our everyday lives, we've moved to implicitly talking about it as a discipline, right? I think that's clear from my comparison of it to history or to English. And I think the extreme of that is what you just described, this idea that not only is it a discipline, but it's a very highly specialized, niche, or random discipline. And I do think that it's worth talking about philosophy in those terms as well, just in disciplinary terms, not as like a random or niche discipline necessarily. Because then that allows us to frame the question in terms of, should everyone read and study philosophy, right? Which is a little bit different from how we initially framed it as, should everyone do philosophy? A synonym for how we originally framed it is, should everyone philosophize? Which it strikes me is a term that we professional philosophers almost never use.
Yeah, to philosophize?
We never use that term. It seems like cringe or like pretentious. I don't know why. I don't think there's anything wrong with the term.
Well,
right?
I mean, it's the verb for the activity of doing philosophy, but I think it brings to mind that reified image of a philosopher lost, especially drawn from the 16th and 17th centuries, just thinking in a vacuum in their study, like reflecting upon the world, like Rodin's The Thinker. And since that's not really what we do, not in that sense, I think we try to avoid it. But it does also sound weirdly pedantic.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing today? I'm going to philosophize. It's better to say like, oh, I'm going to be doing some reading and some writing.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
philosophizing sounds so pompous.
Yeah, totally.
But I wonder why though, because it is just the verb for the thing.
We're bringing it back, folks. We're bringing back philosophizing. But I think too, I'm curious what you think about this point that a lot of times when we talk about doing philosophy, of course we're talking about having conversations, and I really want to preserve a space for that, including in informal conversations. I think when we're asking, should everyone do philosophy, we should be thinking about like friends having a conversation at a bar. When I was an undergrad, I was the president of the philosophy club, and we would just have a question, no required reading would be required. No reading would be required. And we just like come and talk about something. But I think, what we do on Overthink in the podcast is that we talk about a topic, but then we also bring different understandings from different philosophers to the table. And that requires reading, right? And then what we do in our professional lives, a lot of it is writing. So I'm curious how you see the status of reading and writing in this question, should everyone do philosophy?
Yeah, so I would say that there's a very long history of course, dialogue being the most emblematic activity of the philosopher, right? That's what it means to philosophize. It means to be in conversation with others. This is the essence of the Platonic dialogues. And it's only once you switch over to, for instance, from Plato to Aristotle, where there is a notion of a treatise as the standard format for the expression of philosophical thinking, where there is this expectation that you are in a more scholarly dialogue with people who have presented theories before you.
Yeah, although even Aristotle, it's like so much of that is lecture notes.
Yeah,
you know? So I think Aristotle is even less like literary writing oriented than we tend to think. But
yeah, and so I agree that those conversations can be philosophical, but I think where there is a danger is if those conversations get called philosophical when they are unrooted from, discussions that have happened in the field of philosophy. So if you're talking about, moral theory and you have never been exposed to or thought about it in a more rigorous manner. And so maybe I want to say that those conversations count as philosophical when the participants in them have done some legwork of some kind in thinking more rigorously about the subject matter than just like a random conversation at the bar that is unmoored.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you more about that because I feel like, so you're saying that they're not philosophical if they're not doing that legwork. But I think one could alternatively say, or that is what you said. Yeah. It's fine if you want to change your view because that is what philosophical dialogue does. What I was going to say is that one could say that that's just actually bad philosophy, right? So that it's philosophy, but it's poorly done. It's better when we've done that legwork. Okay,
a good point. So maybe we could distinguish between good and bad philosophy, or maybe between more or less philosophical. Yeah. Where it is more philosophical the more that it is rigorous. And I don't mean rigorous in the sense of you're citing your sources and you have memorized who wrote what at what point, but in the sense that you are able to sustain a discussion on a topic, understanding that it is part of a larger conversation in which other voices have been expressed. And so for me, the problem with, and to go back for a hot second to the U.S. educational system, is that it robs students of the opportunity to do that. Yeah. Because it doesn't present students with, some of the basic quote unquote planks from the canon. Yeah. And so when students who may have a legitimate interest in thinking about morality, about art, about politics, they don't know where to even begin. And so for them, philosophizing does seem like weaving stories out of thin air. Yes. And that's, I think, our task as professional academic philosophers, to disabuse them of that.
Yeah. And I'm thinking now about something that happens frequently in philosophy departments. I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of this, which is that somebody will have self-published a book that they say is revolutionizing philosophy, and they decide to send it to everyone in a given philosophy department.
Well, we get that in our Overthink email.
Well, no, so I'm talking about actual hard copies, but I think email
we get
is becoming
PDFs.
increasingly, we get PDFs too. Yeah. They're always, when they come to me, they're always addressed as to Ellie. Yeah. It's never Dr. Anderson. It's always just like, oh, you're a lady philosopher, first name only. Hey, would you like to read this thing I wrote? It's like always men. I don't actually think I've ever.
No,
I think
100% of the emails.
I think 100% of the books and PDFs have been from men or people with male names. I should say. We don't actually know what their gender identity is, but
probably socialized as men.
Yes,
and they write emails as men.
And so the problem with these books, it's, if somebody wants to spend their time writing a book in a field that they're not skilled in, okay, you've got a life to live, do what you enjoy. But I think there are much better ways to do that than to have this sort of hubris of thinking that you're revolutionizing a field that you're not a part of or that you're not
familiar
skilled
with.
in. Yeah, because it's not a question of credentialing. It's not writing off this person because they don't have a PhD. It's taking a quick look and being like, oh, you really don't understand the state of the field at all. And I think philosophy is somehow more vulnerable to this kind of hubris than other fields are. Nobody's gonna come up in their armchair physics fashion with some revolutionary idea of quantum theory and send it to all the people at Caltech and be like, this is my brand new theory. And so I think that, to me, there's just a sort of humility that has to be taken seriously and really leaned into, let's say, not taken seriously, but rather leaned into when you are undertaking philosophy. And that means, familiarizing yourself with the work in the field. And I will say, I don't exempt myself from this need either. I feel constantly humbled when I go into a new subfield and realize how much literature there is. Like, even to this day, as somebody who has been a professional philosopher for a long time, I will think I had this great, brilliant idea, and then I do a Google Scholar search, and 4 other people already said it.
No, and I think so. The way I would articulate that problem that I have with those emails that we do get, is that the authors, and again, if you just enjoy writing and putting your thoughts to paper for pleasure, great. There's nothing wrong with that. But it is the presumptuousness of assuming that you can make an intervention without tarrying with the ideas of other people.
Yeah.
And so without positioning yourself in relation to other thinkers.
Yeah.
And without even knowing the wheels that have already been invented in the past that you are reinventing, and honestly somewhat poorly often.
Totally.
And so for me, those cases come from this idea that we have that to philosophize is just to unravel a thought that is germinating inside my mind, like on my own, without other people. But the introduction of dialogue, of genuine dialogue, whether that's at a bar or with authors from the history of the discipline, what that forces you to do is to recognize that, there might be criticisms of your position that you need to address.
Yes.
That somebody that might have gotten there before you and published it, and it's available on Google Scholar, if you just do a Google search. And also that you might need to do more work before you claim to be an innovator in the discipline.
Yeah, for sure.
So those people shouldn't do philosophy.
Well, you're like, my answer to the question is that there's a group of people who shouldn't do philosophy. But I think what you're talking about also is, like, it's a question of who has a claim on another person's attention, right? So it's one thing for me, let's say that I think I have some exciting ideas about neuroscience and I'm not a specialist in the field. It's one thing for me to think through those with friends. It's another thing for me to email an expert in the field and be like, have you ever thought about this before, right? And so I think people online, the online economy really allows people to think that they're deserving of people's attention when they are not necessarily so. And
the attention of experts in particular.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So I guess they're at least acknowledging an expertise here, which is kind of strange because it sort of seems contradictory to what we're saying before.
It often feels as if, and it's funny that the conversation has gone in this direction, because often what I sense is happening when we get these emails is that the people who are behind them see philosophy not as a way of life, not as a love of wisdom, but really as a source of status, because it does have a lot of cultural weight, right? To say, I am a philosopher. People do look at you differently. They say, oh my gosh, that person must be really smart. Again, because of the way in which the philosopher is constructed in our society. But I do think there are cases where people see philosophy simply as a certificate of approval on the ideas that they have already developed and that they are unwilling to change and let evolve and to think through. A couple of years ago, just to give a concrete example of this, and I felt very conflicted about what to say to this person. An acquaintance from my high school from a long time ago, who at the time was a kind of conservative, religious person, sent me an email and said, hey, I want to be a Christian influencer, basically. And I feel like people don't take me seriously. And I feel like if I had a philosophy PhD, then people would take me seriously. Where do you recommend that I apply to PhD programs so that I can then continue on my current path of being a kind of just a conservative influencer on religious grounds? And I thought, oh, wow, this is a case of somebody who wants to do philosophy, but for the wrong reasons. And although, earlier I made a joke about who shouldn't do philosophy, in that moment, I had the feeling you shouldn't do philosophy if you only see it as a stamp of approval or as a kind of badge of honor. Yeah. But then part of me was like, maybe you should do philosophy because
then you'd realize that it's not that.
It's gonna turn your world upside down.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that would be my thought on here. So I want to pivot a little bit. I also just want to mention in passing, since you mentioned religion here, going back to the beginning for a quick second, this idea that people are often doing philosophy already in their everyday lives. I think we see that in religion. Coming as somebody who used to be Christian, who grew up Christian and is no longer, I think a lot of my initial philosophical questions came out of that context. And in the US, at least, the majority of people are religious. And so I feel like that's kind of as good a suggestion as any that there is some philosophical thinking going on, like among the majority of Americans. Granted, there are lots of things that philosophers have to say about the differences between philosophy and religion, but still, I think like if we're using philosophy super broadly, that's fair to say. But one thing I was just thinking as we're talking about this is, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel has this really beautiful description of explanation. And he says that we love explaining because it's enjoyable to have conversations with ourselves. And so I think that is one of the true joys of philosophy, just like waiting for the bus or being in a Pilates class and thinking about these questions. But those conversations with ourselves, to go back to that point about humility, those don't necessarily then always have to be things that we're publicizing, right? And in this economy where we're constantly encouraged to monetize our hobbies, like it's okay to say, I'm just going to be sitting here in conversation with myself. I also wanted to bring in Aristotle, but I don't want to bring up 3 points in a row. So if you want to say something.
No. I mean, let's turn to Aristotle. The only thought that comes to my mind about this is that although a lot of philosophizing is auto-conversation, especially by the time you get to the stage that we are at, which is, feeling the need or the pressure or the desire to produce also philosophy of our own, it's important to recognize that auto conversation does need to become allo conversation inevitably, right? It needs to become conversation with others. And it can never remain at that solipsistic stage. Not that it ever really is, since the ideas that we develop, either we think about them because we've heard of them from other people, with the resources that have come from our community, from our educational past, so on and so forth. And so that auto conversation, I think, can be a trap sometimes.
Yes.
And you can see this in the case of people who develop an idea that's kind of interesting, but in the research process, at no point test it against another mind.
Okay.
In the sense of getting feedback, getting criticism. And so that's the only thing that comes to mind. The importance of, putting your cards on the table in philosophy and being ready to kind of get precisely what maybe you don't want, which is negative feedback, critical feedback, or the fact that somebody else has gotten there before you.
Totally. Okay, so I want to think a little bit in these final minutes of the conversation about why somebody might say that not everyone should do philosophy, because I feel like there are different ways to read the conversation that we've been having so far, but I think where I'm landing is should everyone do philosophy? Well, if we're thinking about philosophy very broadly as the pursuit of wisdom and as, that's guided by questions, then yeah. And in fact, most
Everyone
of us already
does.
are.
Yes.
But if we're talking about should everyone study philosophy, I, for one, would love to see high schools in the US adopt a philosophy curriculum. I don't know if that's realistic in our lifetimes or not, but I would love to see that. But I think it's fine to say that not everyone needs to study philosophy rigorously. But I want to bring up one kind of point that often gets raised in these conversations, which is the question of privilege, elite status, and leisure. Because ultimately, the idea that philosophy is not for everyone finds its probably not strongest form, but the reference point for it is often Aristotle, who in the Metaphysics talks about philosophy as requiring leisure.
Yeah.
So I just want to read a little bit from that. Is that cool?
Okay.
Do you have anything?
Yeah. No, go for it.
Okay, so this is at the very beginning of the Metaphysics.
I'm going to take notes.
Okay. Aristotle says the following. He says, I'm going to actually just paraphrase the first part. He says, at first the inventor of art, the person who invented art that went beyond the common perceptions of man was naturally admired by men. It's like, oh my God, you created something that goes beyond our common perceptions. Not only because there was something useful in the inventions, but because he was thought wise and superior to the rest. I didn't cross-reference the Greek here, but I'm wondering if art there might actually be, it's probably techne. Yeah.
Yes, I would assume so.
Yes. So in any case, also we could talk about technology here. But as more arts were invented and some were directed to the necessities of life, others to its recreation, the inventors of the latter were always regarded as wiser than the inventors of the former. So the person who devoted their life to recreation rather than to making wheels was considered wiser than the wheel maker. Hence, when all such inventions were already established, the sciences, which do not aim at giving pleasure or at the necessities of life, were discovered. And first in the places where men first began to have leisure. This is why the mathematical arts were founded in Egypt, for there the priestly caste was allowed to be at leisure. So the claim is any inventions that go beyond pleasure or meeting the necessities of human life are kind of happening on this higher level, and that required leisure, which is why you see the development of mathematics in Egypt. What do you think about this, David?
Well, I mean, it seems like time is both the cause and the effect of the development of techne, right? Because you need time to invest in the creation of a new techne, of a new art, whatever that is, whether it's philosophy or writing or mathematics. But then once you create the art further liberates time from people who then get trained in it. And one of the ways in which this has been read in connection to Aristotle is that it ultimately maps onto the class system of ancient Greece.
Exactly,
right? Where it's only the property owning sort of middle class men who are liberated from banalistic work that have the right or the capacity or the time to engage in philosophical labor, in cognitive labor, that is, having these discussions about ethics or metaphysics. And so it ends up restricting philosophy to those whose class status affords them the time to do so. And it is true that philosophy, like any other art, takes time. And it's something that a number of Marxists have recognized, right? That it's very difficult to engage in the quote-unquote higher cognitive intellectual activities when you are fatigued from working 16 hours a day. And so I think it captures a truth, but it's a truth that on a particular reading can lead to a misguided conclusion, which is that only middle class and upper class people should do philosophy, right?
Well, exactly. Because another a sort of different way I hear it put sometimes, often by students who are first gen, for instance, is the stuff that I'm reading would be completely unintelligible to every member of my family. So what's the point? And I think, my first thought always there is, well, that could, there's different ways of understanding that, but that could be a structural problem. The lack of access is a structural problem that, we could be working to overcome. You might have various reasons for being like, not everybody needs to read Kant, but I don't think it's a good argument to say because most people can't read Kant, people shouldn't read Kant, or we shouldn't work towards a future where they might be able to, that it might be more accessible. Do you see what I mean?
I do. And I think also another point to raise here is that those students might actually be surprised by their parents. It's just that the parent-child relationship doesn't offer a lot of opportunities for engaging in the kind of dialogue where you get to know your parents' beliefs about the world, right? Like their status as intellectuals in that Gramscian sense of the term. Who knows? Maybe your mother has some thought about politics that you would not expect because you see her as mother and housewife or whatever, care provider. And the same thing for a father figure. So I think because I keep going back to this reified image of the philosopher, we don't see the philosopher in those around us. The fact that people do have philosophical tendencies, and it's just that they need an opportunity or a forum that elicits that kind of thinking that's already there.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to say, I think there are a lot of people who can't just sit down and read Kant. So I would want to affirm that. But I would say maybe a different way of reading your comment would be that they don't necessarily have to read Kant. Like if they're exposed to the ideas of that and, maybe can become trained. Like it took me a long time to figure out how to read Kant. Then there's something to be had, but you could have probably told me before I started a serious study of philosophy what some of Kant's ideas were, and we could have gotten a conversation going. To follow up on your point about the time for philosophy, I also just want to say that I do think there is something, is it like the Malthus's hierarchy? What's the hierarchy of needs? Is it Maslow. I was like, it's not Malthus. Malthus is the other guy. Yes, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I feel like there's a kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs argument that I sometimes see too, which is that if you're so preoccupied with where your next meal is coming from, whether you're going to have secure housing, whether a bomb might get dropped on your home at any time, I think you're not really going to have the leisure to philosophize. And I think that's not just a question of time. I actually think that is a question of your energy, attention, effort. Like it's just not worth your while to ask what the fundamental objects of existence are and what is the meaning of life, right? And so I do think that's a compelling case for me, at least about the kinds of the kind of freedom that is important for philosophizing. And there have been some recent books coming at this from more or less Marxist angles, arguing that, the freedom to choose how we spend our time is extremely important for liberation. So this isn't an elitist argument. It's actually saying more people should have access to not worrying about these basic needs so they can devote their time so they can devote their time and energy and effort and attention to things that are more life affirming, which, might not be philosophy, but might be.
And I mean, I also think that sometimes those critical conditions, right, of having to worry about where your next meal is coming from or being surrounded by an oppressive system can, in some situations, prompt a kind of awakening, a philosophical awakening in individuals, where they suddenly see the status quo as a problem and as a question in a way that maybe those in a more comfortable position do not. And that's not to romanticize those critical situations, but it is to recognize that sometimes the best philosophy is the one that precisely turns towards the status quo with a critical eye, and that can come from the lived experience of the contradictions of the status quo. So it's not to say that you can be suddenly a professional academic philosopher when you are in a really dire condition, but it is to say that one way in which you can respond to that is by activating critical thinking powers. And there is no rule or formula as to when that does or does not happening, but it is something that I have seen in my students, in people around me, and to some degree even in myself. My interest in philosophy as a high school student really awakened, I would say, at the time in my life that was the most critical in that sense, where I felt the most unsafe, like I had the least level of control over my conditions of life. And in that sense, just thinking about things, about why things were like that, about how they potentially could be otherwise, is what drew me a little bit toward theory and toward philosophy.
Yeah, I remember the philosopher Robert Bernasconi once gave me the advice, philosophize angry. Actually, wait, did he say right? I think he said right angry, and I, based on the fact that we're trying to bring back the word philosophize, inserted that. So Robert Bernasconi told me right angry, but maybe also philosophize angry.
Yeah, just like sit there, you know, like Rodin's the thinker, but really like pouting, really angry, just having angry thoughts.
Okay, we should probably wrap up. David, do you have a single word answer to this question with which we began?
Yeah, should everybody do philosophy? I would say yes. Especially children.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
As well. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have been your Overthink co-hosts, David Peña-Guzmán and Ellie Anderson. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please, we would, go ahead, click that like and subscribe button. And we have our audio podcast, which is where we get into some of the really juicy conversations on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast. I'm done, I guess, talking. And quick other thing, too, we have a Patreon that you can support on patreon.com, where we have monthly Zoom meetings, bonus segments from our podcast episodes, and more, as well as very fun, cute merch. Thank you all so much.